And if there's more, we've got to produce more food, not because we need the money, but because those people look thin. Well, maybe they only look thin because we look progressively so much more fat. So, we need to challenge that particular equation. Yeah, maybe we should be feeding ourselves. I have no problem with export, but why would we choose to export if it's drawing down on our bank accounts? Which is what it is. So Brenda asked us earlier, as we're kind of looking for new definitions. I think we do want commodity production. I think we want GDP. I think what we need is a recognition that you can't have commodity production without a stock that it grows from. Those are our natural resource accounts, and as we draw from those, they go down. And that's why the Ecological Goods and Services account of Alberta is down over the last 100 years. And our GDP has gone up. And they need to come together in what economists would call true economic performance, which is really expressing dollars through time. And I think that's what our kids and our grandkids want. It's not in any way an anti-business approach. It's pro-business, but just putting triple bottom line onto the table. So this presentation was basically fueled by an Action for Agriculture project we did in this landscape upstream of Calgary, trying to look at all the lands that have to come through the community of Calgary and look specifically at some ecological goods and services. I'd like to show you a few maps, zooming into one part of Alberta, but this could be any. We'll look at water quality and supply and carbon, things like that. We remind ourselves that how our ecological goods and services on the landscape are is a function of how we treat the land. I need to show you about what it used to be. We'll call that range of natural variability. It's a reference point, say 200 years ago. We need to look at today. And let's look at basically 2 generations into the future, 70 years. And we're going to contrast treating this landscape 2 ways. One, we're going to continue running land use, but we'll treat it the way we do today. We'll call it business as usual, and we'll contrast that with best management practices. Some key things. They all pertain to agriculture directly or indirectly. First, people, for the most part, live in cities. And the best management practices there is that as the population increases, the push is grow up, not out. And there's a variety of reasons for that. If we're going to allow rural residential, and I've lived on an acreage for, well, I've lived in rural settings all my life basically until a few months ago. But if you're going to allow rural residential, make it clustered, make it nodal. And this concept of these 3-4 hectare acreages continuing to expand out across agricultural lands has to be rethought because for many reasons, but just the cost of building and maintaining infrastructure will kill the municipalities. The settlements and rural residential need to avoid riparian habitat and wetlands. On the forestry side, the best management practices include an expansion of our riparian buffer strips, leaving more residual trees and cut blocks. And in agriculture, no further expansion of croplands into either native rangelands or wetlands. Precision application of fertilizers. So we're still allowing them to fertilize, but doing it in a way that we minimize the amount of runoff and protect riparian areas from livestock grazing. So we actually ran these in a model to see what changes, if any, would occur. So we're going to monetize these ecological goods and services. Carbon, we traded at $75 a metric ton. Water quality basically costs us $55 to take 1 kilo of nitrogen and phosphorus out of water when it gets down to Calgary. Water, we're trading at $1.38 a cubic meter. Tourism, as it's defined, is basically about $620 per hectare if it's optimal tourism, so we'll see how that changes. And food balance is basically looking at the difference between supply and demand. Let's keep track of every mouth, size of the body, how many calories they need, and how many calories are produced in that same area. And then we'll put it all together and call it total ecological goods and services. Let's look at water quality. This is the map of the upper bow 200 years ago. Water quality that's red is not very good, green is really good. Why is it red? There's no people. Well, in the mountains, there's a lot of sediment that moves into water. So the point we need to make right here is Mother Nature can deliver ugly water. And you got to see the riparian buffer strip. So that's before any people or any agriculture. And I'd like to make the caveat from a First Nation standpoint, they're on this metaphorical landscape. Okay, so There's basically contrasting First Nations against the arrival of European cultures thereafter. Here's where we are today. It doesn't look like the western part of this landscape has changed very much, but certainly the eastern has, and that's because of cultivated land and settlements, significantly increasing the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment. If we run it 70 years into the future, and we let particularly urban sprawl occur, the amount of red increases a lot. That is not primarily agricultural expansion. Now, much of this loss is agriculture, but this is primarily urban sprawl. Settlements and acreage is eating agricultural land and native habitat and increasing the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. If we adopt best management practices, so this is business as usual here, compare it to best management practices, a significant difference. Well, I can see it visually, you might not. Let's look at it as a graph. Here is the quality of water, basically at about $500 million. Here's how much we've lost to today, and here's how much we will lose with and without best management practices. So we've already mined this thing down at $10 million a year. And if we continue without best management practices, the cost to treat water in Calgary would be $75 million per year if we wanted to make that water potable. And we can reduce that cost to $21 million. So one of the key points here is there could be a savings of about $55 million a year just in water treatment costs if agriculture and settlements adopted best management practices. So I wonder why the community of Calgary wouldn't put that $55 million on the table right up front. Let's look at water supply. Here's the water supply and basically our aquifers. Here's where it is today. Why is it down? It's basically primarily through agriculture, secondarily through settlements. We have configured these landscapes so they roll water off the landscape so quickly. They're not held, there's not enough organics, there's not enough infiltration. They're running off the main stem rivers and they're not going into aquifers. And we've been doing that for many decades. And it's going to get worse under business as usual. And it will get less worse if we adopt best management practices. We have configured our landscapes for rolling water off so darn quickly. So we're going to see a significant increase in the cost of the value of water in aquifers. Just the amount of water in aquifers and its value from a monetary standpoint is going down. What about biotic carbon? Okay, here's where we were 200 years ago. Again, there wasn't a lot of carbon on the top of those mountains, and you can get to see those rangelands and those riparian habitats quite nicely. Here's where we are. You can see the yellow through here, that's primarily agriculture, and the city, of course, has very little carbon. We basically paved it over. And if we continue with business as usual, we're going to see a significant increase in the loss of carbon, or see a loss of carbon. And with business as usual, we can make a portion of that problem disappear. At $75 a metric ton, we're looking at about a $200 million liability. And we can make about half of that go away with best management practices. What about tourism and recreation? Here we get to see green is high tourism, yellow. People would prefer to look at mountains than they would native rangelands, sorry, Kerry. It's not as good today as it used to be. I guess people from a recreational standpoint don't particularly like Calgary from a recreational standpoint. Business as usual, best management practices. Again, this one's primarily how we deal with human populations living in cities. If these things continue to sprawl out, we're losing our recreational potential off this landscape. And it's a significant amount, $140 million a year liability. And we can make the majority of that go away. Seeing a recurrent pattern here, folks? Best management practices help, but the liability continues to slide. So the point here is you can't best management practice yourself out of trouble. But best management practices are part of the solution. What about food balance? This one may be the key one for you. RNV is First Nations on the landscape. They're basically feeding themselves. They're not importing oranges from Taiwan. We're not exporting food a whole lot either. Here, for every quarter section, we're looking at demand for food and supply. The green shows a surplus of productivity relative to demand. The red shows the exact opposite, which is you have a lot of people and their ability to feed themselves off that quarter section, of course, is very low. That doesn't surprise you. So we've got a lot of people. It's these green landscapes here that are feeding them. That's the farmers. And as we move 7 decades into the future, with that population increasing, the total amount of demand is going to go up. But the key issue is that they're consuming the land that used to feed them. So there's your business as usual and best management practices. Now we could argue that Alberta is an affluent province and we import most of our food anyway, so I mean, why are we growing any of it? We'll just import it. But when I look at this map, what I think of is waking up hypothetically tomorrow at $4 a liter gasoline and going, if that were the case, how would we feed ourselves? What would our food security be? Where would that food come from? Because at $4 a liter, I don't think we're bringing it in from far away. It would be local landowners providing a broad, diverse suite of services. And we are, with current policy, our current policy requires us to pave those agricultural landscapes. Is that a wise piece of policy? I don't think you can undo that once it's happened. I don't think you can recover soils that have been stripped, at least not except for geologic time. So if you add them all together, this is our total ecological goods and services bank account. It's not as good as it used to be, but we still have a lot of water. That water still has quality. We still have the ability to produce food. That landscape still has some carbon. It is still an attractive one, even from recreation. But it will deteriorate. Or not as much. You notice in all these scenarios, we haven't played with the human population. We just let it continue to grow at 2 to 2.5%. And so there's a significant liability. Both these lines are going down. We can make the line go down slower through best management practices. So we do want best management practices. Let's hope someone at some point wants to have a conversation about thresholds too. So, statement. During the next 2 generations, and this is just the upper bow, it will incur a loss of about $550 million worth of ecological goods and services. This equates to the draining of our bank account minimally, and I haven't been showing you all ecological goods and services, just a few, but at least at $8 million a year, at least. And we can make half of that problem go away just through the adoption of best management practices. So the people who live in Calgary minimally could be putting $3 to $8 million a year and just throwing it upstream to the farmers and saying, take this money, adopt these best management practices, and at the end of the day, the people living in Calgary have actually saved money. So the question is, can we initiate a conversation in Alberta about how to fiscally reward land users, residential people, crop people, livestock people, forestry, even recreation, to adopt BMPs? One of the problems we have today is that Joe Farmer only makes money by selling crops. The ranching guy only makes money by selling beef or poultry or whatever. And the forester only makes money by logging. It's his only way to make money. There's no economic incentive for him to manage any of the other attributes on his landscape unless he just happens to be wired that way.